I kept him in my garage for 3 days. What he told me about what is coming will change how you think about faith, power, and responsibility. Warning now, because this is not comfortable stuff. This truth asks you to pay attention and to choose, and it will create shadows as much as light. I will not dress this as myth or sermon. I will show what I saw, the recordings I filmed, the small tests we ran, and why this matters to how you live tomorrow. If you are ready to have what you accepted without question examined, then stay with me. I am not asking you to abandon belief. I am offering a lens that might make your belief practically useful. A month from now, you will see why this mattered to a small Rust Belt town and why you might want to try what I tried. Let me tell you what happened the night the thing in the field scraped the sky like a falling thought. The protagonist of this story is Ethan Cole, a 36-year-old auto mechanic who spent more hours with carburetors than with scripture. He fixed what was broken for a living. He did not expect to fix a bean. He did not expect the bean to show him an interpretation of Jesus and of human potential that his pastor in Sunday services had never mentioned. I cannot promise you absolute proof that convinces everyone, but I can promise layered evidence, sensory evidence, documented records I kept, and an experiment anyone can try. If you listen with patience, I think you will decide for yourself. I am telling this like a reporter who is also confessing what it felt like, and there is a cost to that honesty. Your life could tilt subtly as mine did. Now I will start at the beginning. It began on a humid July night when the air hung like wet cloth and the cicadas sounded like a synthetic hum. Ethan lived on the edge of town in a small house behind a closed auto shop, the kind of place where oil stains were considered folklore and coffee was a currency. At 2 in the morning, the dogs started barking in a way that felt wrong, high and continuous, as if they were trying to memorize a tone. The sound made the windows vibrate and made the air taste metallic. Ethan stepped outside barefoot, grass cool and wet against his skin, and looked toward the field that sat behind his neighbor Sarah Jenkins' house. He saw a light the color of oxidized copper moving low across the corn, and the smell of ozone spiked sharp in his nose. He grabbed his flashlight and his toolbox out of habit, and when he reached the fence, he could hear the metal of something rubbing like silk on stone. Up close, the object looked like a smooth shell, reflective like oil but without seams. It hummed under his feet, made the hairs on his arms stand up. Marcus Hargrove from down the road had called in a report about lights, but Ethan did not think to call the police. Leah Connor, who ran the diner, had once told him to never involve bureaucracy unless you had to. He could have driven away. He could have pretended he had not seen it. Instead, he stepped into the field, where the grass left damp prints on his jeans, and the smell of wet metal and scorched green filled the air. He thought it was a downed drone, then a strange RV, then nothing he had tools for, until he saw movement at the seam of an opening. The being in the opening looked wrong in the most patient, ineffable way. It had a head that was a little too narrow for its face, and eyes that reflected like dark water. Its skin was the color of river stones, and its hands were long with joints that bent in unfamiliar rhythms. It did not move like an animal or a man. When it noticed Ethan, it did not startle. Instead, it extended something like a thin panel and emitted a soft tone that vibrated through the soles of his feet. Sound filled the air like a low bell, and then a voice, not spoken but understood, arrived in his mind as if the night itself had found words. "Do not fear," it said, not in speech but in presence. Ethan would later label the voice as telepathic, because that is the closest word to the experience. For now, he crouched, breath loud in his ears, tools in his hands, and the field smelled like copper and hay, and the sky seemed to listen. He thought of the Bible folded in the glove box of his truck, and of Pastor Daniel, who had once told the congregation that miracles were behind closed doors. He remembered his mother Elena telling him as a child that truth sometimes arrived disguised. He decided, for reasons that would later become clear, and for reasons he could not fully name then, to bring the being home. The first contact was a stuttering bilingual of intention and imitation. Ethan set up a blanket in the back corner of his garage, under a single bulb that hummed, and he propped the being on a crate. It drank light the way a plant drinks rain. He offered water, which it tested with thumb and index the way a scientist tests an experiment. The dialogue that followed was not simple conversation, but a sequence of translations that Ethan recorded on his phone. The following is a reconstruction of exchanges between them in the hours that followed, rendered into direct speech for clarity. "Can you understand me?" Ethan asked aloud, voice small. The being projected a warmth like a memory, and then sent words directly. "Understand differently." Ethan laughed nervously. "You can speak English?" The response arrived as an image first, then a signal adopted. "We learn from sound." "What are you?" Ethan asked. The being hesitated like a man who has kept a secret too long. "Traveler," it said. "Ambassador," Ethan said, trying to put a label on what he did not want to name. "Not ambassador," the being corrected. "Messenger of pattern. We map frequency." Ethan swallowed and said, "Why are you here?" The being pushed a slow ripple of feeling, a memory of sky corridors and of a place that felt like a library of storms. "Observe and remind," it transmitted. "A pattern lost, a stitch in memory." Ethan asked, "Are you alone?" The creature showed a brief flurry of images and a single word that felt like cold and light at once. "No." It then added, "but separate." Ethan found himself asking about Jesus, and the words came out before he could stop them. "Did you come because of him?" The being's presence narrowed like a lens. It sent an image of a man walking along stones, speaking to people, and there was a thread of light in his hands. It did not speak disrespectfully. It offered context. "One name among many carriers," it said. "He carried pattern that others could not read. He tuned expression to human frequency." Ethan listened, heart hammering, as the being articulated a thesis that felt both foreign and oddly familiar. Jesus, it communicated, translated consciousness in a way that could be remembered as faith. The crucifixion was a test of frequency. Pain amplified the release of a pattern. People thereafter clung to ritual because ritual repeated that frequency without understanding the mechanism. Ethan's mouth moved, but the words were almost private. "So, you are saying faith is a technology?" The being's reply was like a wind passing through chimes. "Thought is signal. Emotion is amplifier. Intention is focus. Together they manifest." That dialogue stretched into a dozen more exchanges, sometimes one line, sometimes long streams of imagery and feeling, until the early light skinned the horizon. They spoke of words that the being translated into our categories: consciousness, frequency, manifestation, crucifixion, redemption. The conversation was interrupted by raps at the garage door. It was only Officer Ruiz checking a noise complaint. Ethan stepped to the door, palms still oily, and told a quick excuse about a late repair. He did not call for a crisis. He did not mention the being. The night smelled of engine oil, coffee grounds from the shop, and rain on the pavement. Through those checks and small lies, the bond deepened. The next block of the story is the hands-on work. Ethan understood metal. He understood patience. He had to repair a device on the being's side, an object the being called an amplifying core. It looked like a crystal set inside a lattice of metal that did not corrode. He held it, and it thrummed against his skin like a heartbeat. His workshop table vibrated faintly. The description of the repair matters because it establishes that his skills were credible and that the being trusted skill over sermon. The technical description that follows is brief and practical. The core was composed of interlaced crystalline filaments, each filament coated by a polymer he had never seen. The fix required trimming warped filaments with a heated tungsten tip, calibrating resonance by adjusting the pitch of 3 elliptical coils, and sealing the lattice with a small quantity of conductive resin sourced from a broken solar inverter. The process required precision, a thermometer to read micro-temperature changes, and a digital oscillator to match frequencies. He recorded the steps on his phone so he would not forget. As he worked, the garage filled with tactile smells and sensations: The hazy scent of solder, the rough grit of metal shavings under his nails, the taste of copper on his tongue after he licked a thumb to count wire, the coolness of the crystal as it cooled under glue, the faint electric percussion in his skull that accompanied the device warming to life. The being observed quietly, occasionally sending images that helped him find a pitch. Match thought to tone, it said. Make a bridge. Dialogue while repairing was sparse but intimate. Is this safe? Ethan asked. We are fragile, and those we touch are more fragile, it replied. But safety is a choice. You chose to open. The repair taught both of them patience and created mutual trust. When the device hummed and a thin holographic register flickered above the workbench, everything shifted into the revelation portion of the story. The register projected not only images, but what the being called a record, a layered encoding that combined visual, vibrational, and story data. It showed sequences from ancient times, not as history books, but as energetic maps. There was a scene of a man teaching on a hillside, and as he spoke, silver threads of light left his hands and entered the heads of those listening. The being explained, in a series of patient translations and demonstrations, that some human teachers had been carriers of a method to alter collective expectation. The method was not supernatural in the sense of breaking laws. It was procedural. It involved aligning thought with feeling and using communal ritual as a resonant amplifier. The being used the words thought, emotion, frequency, manifestation, source, and crucifixion repeatedly to make meaning. It showed how ceremonies, words, and pain were methods for shifting group frequency when literacy and mass media did not exist. The register included diagrams that looked like stained glass patterns but pulsed with math. Ethan watched a record where a small group applied a pattern and a sick child rose from a mat, not because of mystical fiat, but because the community shifted attention in a focused way that changed behavior and electrochemical state. The being narrated slowly, and Ethan asked questions in a sequence that became almost like a classroom. Does that mean Jesus did not save souls? He asked, nervous. He taught a method, the being said. He exposed a pattern to be practiced. Translation over centuries made the practice into dogma and metaphor, but the practice remains as a technique of focusing consciousness. They had at least 12 exchanges about interpretation, about scripture, about the Bible as a layered document that included historical, allegorical, and energetic instructions. At one point, Dr. Hargrove's name surfaced in Ethan's mind, because Hargrove had once shown Ethan a marginal note in an old family Bible. Ethan asked the being, "Why show me this?" The being replied, "Small hands can change local fields. You fix things. You listen. You can model the method in action, not in pulpit." That was the kernel. The being did not aim to overturn devotion. It offered a practical grammar. Thought creates signal, emotion amplifies, focused intention tunes frequency, and manifestation follows. The being called that last step coincidence aligning into pattern. They tested the idea the next morning. The experiment was simple and small scale, but designed to be repeatable. Step 1. Choose an object and a simple, measurable change. Step 2. Focus thought for 5 minutes on the desired outcome while cultivating a steady emotion that matched the desired state. Step 3. Use a minor physical action to anchor the intention, like placing the chosen object in a certain configuration. Step 4. Observe for synchronistic evidence within a tight window. They invited 3 neighbors to participate not as subjects but as volunteers. Leah from the diner, Pastor Daniel, and Tommy Bennett, who worked at the feed store, each took part. The controlled element was whether a requested delivery would arrive within a time window. Ethan recorded baseline odds, and the volunteers logged their emotional states. The first run seemed like coincidence. The delivery arrived earlier than predicted, and the driver mentioned a wrong GPS fix. The second run produced a number sequence repeated on receipts across 3 independent transactions. The third run produced a small healing in Pastor Daniel's cut finger that had been slow to close. We documented each event with timestamps, receipts, photos, and video. For the skeptic, there were gaps. For the open-minded, there was pattern. The being explained that amplifiers like the crystal allowed attention to couple to environmental noise in precise ways. The experiment section was soft science, not hard proof. It was enough to nudge belief, not to democratize certainty. After the third test, Ethan posted a short clip on a private message group with 3 friends to get feedback. The clip was labeled only "Ask." Comments came back from Dr. Hargrove, from Sarah Jenkins, and from an archivist named Miriam, who offered a possible historical parallel. It was at this point in the narrative that I pause and ask you to interact, because community verification is part of the process. If this moves you, write in the comments now what you felt when the delivery arrived early. Start your comment with "aware" if you have experienced synchronicity, or "doubt" if this seems like an accidental correlation. Your responses matter because they form the second layer of observation beyond what I report. Keeping him in the garage forced an internal reckoning for Ethan. He had never been a man of radical gestures, but the knowledge of what the being revealed lodged itself like a splinter. He worried about responsibility. If he publicized this, he might be protected or persecuted. If he stayed silent, he might be complicit in hoarding a technique that could help people. The first moment of tension came when Pastor Daniel unexpectedly dropped by and saw the crystal on the workbench. Ethan felt the room shrink and the air sharpen. He lied about where he had gotten a replacement headlight, and Pastor Daniel's eyes softened with pastoral concern. That conversation stretched, and inside Ethan, his judgment spun. He imagined headlines, theft, government interest, but mostly he imagined failure to care. The tension lasted until Pastor Daniel left, blessing the shop and mentioning prayer. Ethan felt guilt and relief in equal measure. The second moment of tension occurred when a local news blogger named Tommy discovered a blurred photo of the light in the field and began asking pointed questions. He knocked on Ethan's door with a recorder and a smile, and the community buzzed. The third moment of tension was deeper and internal. Ethan lay awake and saw images of his mother Elena standing by a hospital bed. The memory of the times he had held a wrench while she prayed over a failing joint. He had promised himself that he would have a simple life. Now that promise felt like a rope he was tugging against. Each moment of tension I describe wants you to feel the slow increase in stakes. The details are important. The smell of Pastor Daniel's cologne, the sound of Tommy's recorder, the pressure in Ethan's chest like a wave right behind his sternum. Each tension paragraph was a small crucible where decision hardened. Ethan's backstory matters because it explains why he became the vessel of choice. He grew up in a small town where the church bell was as regular as the train. His father had worked construction and left early. His mother Elena told stories from the Bible, but also taught him how to take apart a carburetor. He learned faith as practice and machines as truth. As a teen, he left for a welding job in another state and returned with calloused hands and questions. He had been engaged once and called it off because he feared being seen as small. He had lost a brother to an overdose, and that loss taught him not to promise miracles. He worked odd shifts, took night classes to learn electronics, and kept a battered Bible in his glove compartment alongside a notebook with sketches of engine parts. These facts form 3 short thematics: the practical skill set that made him credible, the religious context that made him receptive to the being's explanations, and the personal losses that gave him a deep sense of moral responsibility. Together, these threads explain why Ethan was willing to house a being, to run experiments, and to shoulder the social consequences. As the third day approached, the being grew quieter. It spent long hours by the window, watching rain and movements of light like a child watching a parade. Ethan asked whether it could stay longer. "Cannot," it said simply, in a way that felt like an ocean naming a stone. Before leaving, it offered him a small object wrapped in cloth. The object was a crystal the size of a walnut, cloudy with internal filaments. It pulsed faintly against Ethan's palm and warmed when he touched it. "Keep this as reminder and as tool," the being communicated. It taught Ethan a simple practice to use with the crystal. 5 minutes of focused thought, a single emotion matched to the thought, and a small anchoring action. It explained the science like this in a brief technical note. The crystal acts as an amplifier, coupling intention to ambient stochastic noise. When you maintain a coherent internal signal for a critical duration, you bias decoherence pathways toward desired micro-outcomes. That explanation was short and clinical, but it gave a plausibility framework the way a schematic does. They spoke for a long time before departure. "We do not come to save," it said. "We come to remind. The future is a field of bifurcation. You will be asked to choose how you align." Ethan asked, "What will happen to us?" The being looked at him as if it saw his whole life. "A time when frequency matters more than force. You will have choices that will not be labeled as spiritual alone. Infrastructure, energy, health, polity will react to collective alignment. You will need practices that stabilize intention. Some will use them for profit or power. Others will use them to heal. This is a test of stewardship." Then it placed a mapped image in Ethan's mind of a city humming with lights that shifted like a heartbeat and of people pausing to breathe. The being then moved toward its craft and left with a sound like a bell being swallowed. The aftermath centered on how a small town responded and what changed in Ethan's life. In the first month, Ethan used the crystal as instructed, focusing 5 minutes each morning on small, reasonable outcomes. He recorded everything. He recorded coincidences and outcomes with timestamps and names. Leah from the diner noticed that the casserole she made started to sell out faster when Ethan focused on community abundance. Sarah Jenkins reported that her chronic backache eased after she participated in a guided 5-minute session Ethan led in his garage. Pastor Daniel called and said he had tried the practice before a counseling session and reported deeper empathy with a parishioner. Dr. Hargrove, a retired physicist, visited and examined the crystal with a handheld spectrometer. He recorded an unusual crystalline lattice and declared it anomalous, though not necessarily alien. Miriam, the archivist, offered historical parallels from marginal notes in early modern texts about songstones that helped focus communal prayer. Tommy the blogger softened after seeing the documentation and wrote a tempered article that framed the events as an experiment rather than an expose. By the end of the month, Ethan had formed a small group of practice that met weekly. They called themselves the Workshop because they focused on repair and practice. They included Leah, Pastor Daniel, Dr. Hargrove, Sarah, Tommy, and Elena on occasion. The group kept records, hosted a community breakfast, and refused to monetize what they learned. They advertised nothing and remained a volunteer network. At 3 months, things rippled wider. A local farmer named Owen Lewis reported that changing attention at planting times, a practice they had adapted, coincided with a small uptick in germination rates across 3 plots. A nurse named Carmen, who volunteered at the clinic, said that staff morale increased after 2 months of short collective focus sessions before shifts. Sarah Jenkins opened a bulletin board in her diner listing anecdotal reports and cautionary notes. Miriam published a short piece in a regional historical journal drawing parallels between meditative practices in pre-modern communities and the group practices that Ethan had revived. Dr. Hargrove published a careful technical note about the crystal that avoided sensational language and proposed further lab work. He named a colleague at the State University who might be willing to do spectroscopy under controlled conditions. The town was quieter but talkative. Some neighbors were skeptical, some fearful, some grateful. Pastor Daniel integrated 5 minutes of reflective focus into his pastoral visits, framing it as prayer with intentional breath and clear purpose. Tommy the blogger began a series called Local Experiments that looked at small civic practices. The workshop grew to include a biotechnician named Irina and an old metal worker called Ben who came to help make simple housings for the practice tools. The community began to see small practical changes and, more importantly, a new ethic about attention. 6 months out, the consequences were more public and structural. Dr. Hargrove's colleague, Dr. Alina Reyes, ran a controlled laboratory test on material similar to the crystal and published preliminary data suggesting unique resonant properties under certain electromagnetic constraints. The local clinic reported a small but measurable reduction in stress-related complaints. Pastor Daniel organized a community day where people applied the 5-minute practice to a local issue and then took collective action on that issue. Ethan returned to work at his shop but offered free sessions on Saturday mornings for those who wanted to learn the practice. The workshop had formed an informal code of stewardship that emphasized consent, transparency, and refusal to weaponize the method. 5 new named figures had entered the story by month 6: Irina, Ben, Owen, Carmen, and Dr. Alina Reyes. The town had more small acts of care. Some local businesses reported modest upticks in sales that they attributed to changes in community coordination rather than magic. Importantly, the practice had no instant wealth. It created shifts in attention that had cumulative effects. Ethan found a steady client who needed custom wiring, and that steady job eased his financial anxiety. Elena, who had been skeptical, now attended a meeting and said that the 5 minutes helped her sleep. The experiment that began as private in a garage had become a local ethic with safeguards. Throughout the narrative, Ethan wrestled with responsibility. He had to decide what to share publicly and what to guard. He wrestled with his own temptation to sensationalize. He refused to monetize the crystal. He refused to offer promises of miracles. He invited scrutiny and documentation. He also learned that accountability mattered because power in the hands of the unexamined becomes harm. He spoke with Dr. Alina about protocols, with Pastor Daniel about pastoral care, and with Irina about ethics. The final scenes show a kind of quiet stewardship rather than triumphalism. Ethan kept a ledger of who used the practice and for what ends. He insisted that any use for political manipulation would be refused. He taught a simple practice to a classroom of teenagers at the community center and watched them giggle and then breathe. The laughter was a kind of cleansing. As for the prophecy the being had given, it distilled into 3 practical predictions and 1 moral instruction. Prediction 1. There would be periods where collective attention would have outsized effects on small systems, and communities that adapted practices to stabilize attention would fare better. Prediction 2. Technologies that couple human intention to environmental systems would proliferate, and those technologies would need ethical frameworks. Prediction 3. The greatest battles coming would involve stewardship of attention rather than brute force. The moral instruction was simple and hard. Choose stewardship over domination. Use whatever power you discover to repair and to tend, not to coerce. Ethan recorded the being saying, "We come to remind you that frequency matters. You can feed fear or you can feed skill. The future will test which you choose." At the end, I return to you. The practical takeaway I offer is not a creed. It is a small method you can try tomorrow. 5 minutes. Pick one reasonable thing. Pair a clear thought with a supporting emotion. Anchor it with a small action. Keep a simple log and look for small synchronies. If you do this with people you trust, document it and keep ethics front and center. If you decide to comment, remember the format I asked earlier. Start with aware if you have tried something like this, doubt if this feels impossible, or question if you have a careful objection. Your comment will help build the next layer of evidence and conversation. If you found this meaningful, consider subscribing to follow the archived recordings and the measured tests I plan to publish. Share with someone who practices responsibly. This story ends not with a neat miracle, but with a choice. A man who fixed engines, held a crystal, hosted a being for 3 nights, and learned that the most important tools are attention and responsibility. He did not become wealthy, nor did he become famous. He became a steward in a small town that decided to try collective care. The evidence I show is layered and imperfect. It is enough to make a reasonable person curious and to push a careful person to verify. If you want more, I will publish the raw footage, the logs, and the technical notes from Dr. Hargrove and Dr. Alina. For now, remember this simple line: thought creates, emotion amplifies, certainty manifests. Use that with discipline and compassion.